They had everything. Predator drones orbiting at 20,000 feet, feeding full-motion video into a windowless operations center in Balad. Signals intercept teams from Task Force Orange pulling fragments of conversations out of the air, burner phones, couriers, encrypted chatter that wasn't supposed to be heard. Delta Force assault squadrons on standby, boots already laced, weapons laid out in precise silence. MH-60 Black Hawks idling on the tarmac, rotors ticking in the dry Iraqi night. And still, the target kept slipping. He wasn't fast. He wasn't heavily guarded. He didn't command divisions or armored columns. He moved through cities like Baghdad and Mosul without escorts, sometimes on foot, sometimes in the back seat of a taxi that no one would ever remember. They hit the houses anyway. Night after night, JSOC task forces would launch under darkness, wheels up within minutes of authorization. The chain of command was compressed, almost aggressive. Intelligence flowed from analysts to operators without the usual friction. A name surfaced, a location narrowed, a pattern identified. Approval came fast, sometimes too fast. The helicopters would arrive low and fast, under 100 feet, avoiding radar, kicking up sand and trash as they flared into tight urban courtyards. Breachers would move first. Charges placed. Doors folded inward. Delta operators flooding rooms with disciplined violence, clearing corners, controlling bodies, securing documents. And then the silence. No target. Just heat signatures fading from the ISR feed. Phone still warm. Laptops still open. Tea still steaming in chipped glasses on the floor. They were always minutes late. Sometimes less. Task Force Orange would rewind the intercepts. Analysts would reconstruct the timeline. The signals had been clean. The geolocation was precise. The pattern matched. Everything aligned. Except reality. The system was working exactly as designed. Intelligence was being collected, processed, and acted upon faster than ever before. The cycle, from intercept to assault, had been compressed into hours, sometimes minutes. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Because the man they were hunting wasn't just moving. He was reacting. And every time the system accelerated, he adapted faster. The system expanded. More drones. More analysts. More targets. By late 2004, the Joint Special Operations Command had built something no military had ever attempted at this scale. A continuous targeting machine. Predator feeds ran in. Parallel over Fallujah, Baghdad, Tikrit. Signals intelligence from Task Force Orange layered over human reporting from CIA Special Activities Division case officers embedded across the country. Every fragment was pulled into the same architecture. It looked complete. It wasn't. Every night, the same sequence repeated with mechanical precision. A signal intercept. A triangulated handset. A courier track between safe houses. Analysts in the operations center would build what they called a pattern of life. Movement cycles, sleep locations, meeting points. It created the illusion of predictability. And then JSOC would strike. Delta Force assault troops, organized into tight, four-man elements, would load into MH-6 Little Birds or Black Hawks depending on distance and urban density. Weapons were standardized for confined engagements. For 116 Hong Kong dollars carbines. Surefire suppressors. PQ, 2 infrared designators visible only through night vision. Every man knew his sector before the helicopter even touched ground. The execution was flawless. The outcome wasn't. Houses were cleared in under 4 minutes. External security established within 30 seconds. Sensitive site exploitation teams moved immediately. Hard drives pulled, SIM cards bagged, notebooks photographed before they even left the room. But the target was never there. Not when it mattered. They started to widen the net. Instead of one house, they hit 3, then 5. Simultaneous raids across districts, coordinated down to the second. ISR platforms were stacked overhead, feeding live video into command nodes where officers from JSOC, CIA, and NSA sat shoulder to shoulder, watching doors get breached in real time. Still nothing. The intelligence kept saying he should be there. The system kept proving he wasn't. Frustration began to bleed into the process, but it didn't look like frustration. It looked like acceleration. Approval thresholds dropped. Confidence levels adjusted. The time between intercept and action compressed even further. What used to take hours now took less than 30 minutes. The assumption was simple. Speed would close the gap. It didn't. Because speed was visible. Every helicopter that lifted off from Balad or Al-Assad created a signature. Rotor noise traveled across flat urban terrain for kilometers, especially in the still air before dawn when temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. Locals heard it. Networks heard it. And the man they were hunting heard it too. He didn't need satellites to know they were coming. He needed ears. Couriers moved faster. Meetings shortened. Phones were discarded after a single use. Safe houses rotated not daily, but hourly. Sometimes the target would leave a location less than 10 minutes after arriving, not because he had been compromised, but because he assumed he would be. And increasingly, he was right. The more JSOC tightened its cycle, the more predictable it became. Patterns formed, not in the target's behavior, but in their own. Task Force Orange would pick up a signal. Analysts would flag it as high value. Command would authorize immediate action. Helicopters would launch within a fixed response window. Always fast, always direct, and always detectable. They had built a machine designed to eliminate delay. What they hadn't accounted for was observation. The enemy wasn't blind. He didn't need to break encryption or penetrate databases. He just needed to watch what happened after a phone call was made. And what happened was always the same. Within minutes, somewhere in the sky, rotor blades would begin to turn. Within minutes, somewhere on the ground, men with night vision would begin to move. It became a signal in itself, an unintentional one. They thought they were hunting a man. In reality, they were training him. Every failed raid gave him data. Every near miss refined his instincts. Every pattern of life analysis fed into his understanding of how they operated. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, the balance shifted. JSOC had more technology, more firepower, more reach. But the man they were chasing had something else. He understood the rhythm of their system better than they did. And he began to move between its gaps. It looked like a failure of speed. It wasn't. Speed was never the limitation. By 2005, JSOC had already done what most military systems couldn't. They had collapsed the distance between intelligence and action. Signals intercepts from Task Force Orange flowed directly into targeting cells. CIA Special Activities Division officers fed human reporting into the same pipeline. NSA analysts filtered metadata in near real time. There were no institutional walls left. No bureaucratic delays. Everything moved. And yet the outcome didn't change. The problem was not collection. The problem was interpretation. They believed they were tracking a man. In reality, they were tracking his shadow. Every signals intercept they captured, every phone call, every SIM card. Activation was treated as a direct extension of the target. A location meant presence. A pattern meant habit. A connection meant proximity. But the network they were mapping wasn't centralized. It was distributed. The man they were hunting did not operate like a conventional commander. He didn't maintain fixed headquarters. He didn't rely on persistent communications. He didn't even stay in contact with the same intermediaries for long. He operated through layers. Couriers who never met each other. Safe houses that existed for hours, not days. Phones that were activated once, then destroyed. Instructions passed verbally, fragmented, deliberately incomplete. Task Force Orange could intercept signals. What they couldn't intercept was intent. So they filled the gaps. Analysts began building models. Predictive frameworks. If a courier moved from District A to District B and a handset activated for 90 seconds near a known facilitator, then probability suggested the target might be present. Might. That word carried weight inside the system. But it was buried under confidence percentages, heat maps, and pattern overlays that made uncertainty look like precision. They weren't lying to themselves. They were refining assumptions that had never been tested. The system rewarded correlation. It amplified patterns. It turned fragments into narratives that felt complete. And once those narratives were accepted, they moved fast, too fast to question. Because questioning slowed things down. And speed had become doctrine. There was another problem. Less visible. More dangerous. JSOC had integrated intelligence and operations into a single continuous loop. Analysts sat alongside operators. Decisions were made in shared rooms, often within minutes. The traditional separation, where intelligence was questioned, challenged, validated, had been compressed out of existence. It felt efficient. It removed friction. It also removed doubt. When a signals intercept came in, the same people who processed it were often the ones pushing for action. There was no distance between assessment and execution. No second layer to slow the process down and ask a different question. Is this real? Or is this what we expect to see? The system didn't break. It became too smooth, too confident. And the target, Whoever he was, wherever he moved, began to exploit that confidence without ever touching the system itself. He didn't hack it. He shaped it. Every time a phone was used briefly, then discarded, it created a signal spike. Every time a courier moved quickly between locations, it generated a pattern. Every time a meeting was staged, real or not, it produced a cluster of activity that analysts couldn't ignore. It looked like behavior. It looked like movement. It looked like presence. But it wasn't necessarily him. Sometimes it was a decoy. Sometimes it was routine activity misinterpreted under pressure. And sometimes it was nothing at all. Just noise. But in a system designed to act quickly, noise doesn't stay noise for long. It becomes a target. The problem was not that JSOC lacked intelligence. The problem was that they had too much of the wrong kind. Signals intelligence told them where something happened. It didn't tell them why. Human intelligence could have filled that gap, but human networks were thin, fragile, and often distrusted. Building them took time. Time meant delay. Delay meant missed opportunities. So the system leaned into what it could process fastest. Signals, metadata, patterns, things that could be measured, things that could be acted on immediately. And the man they were hunting understood something they didn't. He understood that being seen was not the same as being found. So he allowed fragments of himself to appear, through others, through signals, through movement that wasn't quite real. Just enough to trigger the machine. Just enough to pull it in the wrong direction. The more they chased those fragments, the more they reinforced their own assumptions. They believed proximity meant presence. They believed patterns meant predictability. They believed speed would close the gap. But the gap wasn't physical. It was conceptual. They were fighting an enemy who did not exist in the way they needed him to. And until they understood that, every raid would end the same way. A breached door, an empty room, and a system that couldn't explain why. They didn't slow down at first. They tried to go faster. More ISR platforms were pushed into the stack. Additional Predator and MQ-1C Gray Eagle orbits were assigned to urban corridors where signal density was highest. Task Force Orange expanded its collection priorities, pulling not just target-specific communications, but entire networks, friends, facilitators, families, anyone who might generate a usable signal. The map became denser. More connections, more nodes, more movement. It felt like progress. It wasn't, because density isn't clarity. And somewhere inside that expanding network, a quiet realization began to surface, not as a directive, not as a formal assessment, but as a pattern that certain operators couldn't ignore. The raids that worked didn't come from signals. They came from people. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss. A tip from a local source that led to a mid-level facilitator. A detainee who, under controlled questioning, revealed a meeting location that wasn't tied to any intercept. A fragment of human reporting that didn't fit the model, but turned out to be accurate. Those operations felt different, less precise on paper, more decisive on the ground. Inside JSOC, that created tension, because the system they had built was designed around measurable intelligence. Signals could be tracked, verified, cross-referenced. Human sources couldn't. They were inconsistent, vulnerable to deception, dependent on trust that didn't scale. But they were seeing something the system wasn't. Intent. The shift didn't come from a single decision. It came from friction. Operators from Delta Force began pushing back, not against the missions, but against the assumptions driving them. Troop commanders, many of them with years of experience in irregular environments, started questioning why certain targets were being prioritized purely on signal activity. The answers were always the same. Because the data supports it. Because the pattern is clear. Because the window is closing. And yet, the rooms were still empty. At the same time, CIA Special Activities Division officers, working parallel networks outside the JSOC targeting cycle, were building something slower. Human networks seeded over months. Tribal contacts. Informants who weren't visible to signals intercepts because they didn't use phones at all. They moved differently. They listened more than they transmitted. And when they spoke, it wasn't constant. It was deliberate. That difference mattered. Because the enemy wasn't communicating continuously. He was communicating selectively. JSOC had built a system optimized to catch continuous signals. But the target only existed in moments. Short windows. Controlled interactions. Decisions made face-to-face, beyond the reach of interception. To find him, they would have to operate inside those same constraints. And that required a different doctrine. Not faster, quieter. The change began at the edges. Instead of launching immediately on every intercept, certain targeting cells started holding back. Not long, sometimes just an hour, sometimes less, but enough to observe what happened next. Did the signal persist? Did the movement continue? Or did it disappear the moment attention was applied? Patterns began to fracture. Some signals that once triggered immediate raids were now recognized as noise, brief spikes that led nowhere. Others, when left alone, expanded. Networks revealed themselves not through pressure, but through patience. Task Force Orange adjusted its posture. Instead of focusing solely on immediate geolocation, analysts began mapping duration and behavior over time. Which devices stayed active longer than expected? Which nodes remained silent after key events? Absence became as important as presence. At the same time, Delta Force assault squadrons adapted their deployment cycles. Instead of constant high-visibility launches, certain operations shifted to delayed insertion windows. MH-47 Chinooks would stage further out, beyond the audible range of dense urban areas, while ground elements moved the final distance on foot or in unmarked civilian vehicles. It was slower, less predictable, harder to coordinate, but it removed the signal they had been broadcasting without realizing it. No more immediate response. No more consistent timing. The enemy could no longer assume that a phone call would trigger a helicopter within minutes. And that uncertainty began to work in reverse. CIA SAD networks expanded quietly in parallel. Informants were not tasked to confirm what signals already suggested. They were tasked to contradict them, to find where the model was wrong, not where it was right. That changed the questions. Instead of asking, "Where is he now?" the system began asking, "Where would he feel safe enough to stay?" The answer was rarely where the signals pointed. It was where nothing happened. No calls, no movement, no detectable pattern, just silence. And inside that silence, presence. JSOC didn't abandon technology. They rebalanced it. Signals intelligence became a tool for narrowing possibilities, not defining them. Human intelligence became the mechanism for understanding intent. Operations slowed just enough to allow both to align. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. The system didn't become less aggressive. It became more selective. Fewer raids, more deliberate targets, longer surveillance windows. And for the first time, the machine stopped reacting and started observing. The man they had been chasing hadn't changed, but the way they understood him finally did. And in that shift, something else happened. The gap began to close, not because they moved faster, but because they stopped moving when they didn't understand what they were seeing. The call didn't come fast. That was the first difference. Inside the JSOC operations floor at Balad Air Base, the air was stale, recycled through industrial vents that never quite removed the smell of dust and fuel. It was just past 2:10 local time. Temperature outside had dropped to 18 degrees Celsius. The city was quieter now. Not silent. Never silent. But slower. Task Force Orange had been watching the node for 6 days. Not continuously. Not aggressively. Deliberately. The signal had appeared once, briefly, on a low-power handset in eastern Baghdad. 32 seconds of activity. No voice content recovered. Just metadata. The device had connected, transmitted, and gone dark. Under the old system, that would have triggered an immediate raid. This time, they waited. On the second day, nothing. On the third, a courier was observed. Not through signals, but through eyes. A CIA Special Activities Division asset, placed months earlier inside a mid-level facilitation network, reported a man arriving on foot, staying less than 10 minutes, leaving without speaking to anyone outside the structure. No phone, no visible security. That mattered. On the fourth day, the same handset activated again. 21 seconds. Same location. Then silence. Task Force Orange flagged it, but didn't push. Instead, they built outward. Devices that never activated in proximity. Numbers that should have called, but didn't. Absence patterns layered over minimal signals. It was incomplete, but it was consistent. Something was being protected. And for once, the system didn't rush to fill in the gaps. The request moved up the chain slowly. From the targeting cell to the JSOC duty officer. From there to the on-site commander representing Joint Task Force operations. The CIA liaison didn't argue for action. He argued for confirmation. That was new. Delta Force B Squadron was already in theater. Troop elements had been rotating through short-cycle missions for weeks, but this one felt different before it even began. Not because of urgency, because of restraint. The mission profile was adjusted accordingly. No immediate air assault. No visible insertion. The target building sat in a dense urban block, narrow streets, 2 to 3-story concrete structures, electrical lines sagging between rooftops. Civilian presence was unpredictable even at night. Dogs, generators, insomniacs, all variables that couldn't be controlled once noise entered the equation. So they removed noise. Insertion point was set 2.8 kilometers away, beyond the auditory footprint of rotor wash. 2 MH. 47 Chinooks from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment lifted at 3:05, running low and offset from known observation corridors. No lights. Terrain following radar engaged. Airspeed held steady at 110 knots. They didn't approach the target. They approached the absence of attention. The aircraft set down in a dry irrigation field, rotors kicking up fine dust that settled quickly in the still air. Delta operators disembarked in sequence. No verbal commands, just hand signals and timing. Equipment was minimal but precise. 416 Hong Kong dollars carbine suppressed. And /PVS, 15 night vision systems. Lightweight breaching kits distributed across the element. They moved immediately. Foot approach. No vehicles. Distance closed over 23 minutes. Pace controlled. Not fast enough to generate noise. Not slow enough to lose momentum. They crossed 2 alley networks. Paused twice to observe pattern disruptions. Lights turning on, silhouettes at windows. Nothing sustained. Nothing reactive. Above them, ISR coverage remained, but at a distance. No low-hover platforms. No persistent noise. Just high-altitude observation feeding limited updates back to the operations floor. Task Force Orange monitored passively. No new signals. That was the signal. At 3:41, the outer security element established position. For operators covering ingress routes, thermal optics scanning for movement beyond visual range. Internal assault element stacked on the primary entry point. A reinforced metal door, standard for the district. No charge. Too loud. Mechanical breach. The lead operator worked the tool in silence. 30 seconds. 40. The lock gave with a muted crack. They entered without announcement. First room cleared in under 5 seconds. Second room empty. Third, occupied. 2 individuals. Not the target. They were secured immediately. No resistance. No alarms. Just confusion. The team leader didn't hesitate. He moved deeper, because the model had changed. This wasn't about confirming presence through resistance or signal. It was about reading the environment. The air inside the structure was warmer than outside by at least 4 degrees. A secondary heat source. Recent activity. Not hours. Minutes. Upstairs. The staircase was narrow. Concrete steps, worn at the center. The second element moved up, spacing tight, weapons angled to minimize silhouette exposure. At the top, another door. Closed. Unlocked. Inside, the room was dim. A single low-watt bulb. No windows open. No airflow. And there, seated against the far wall, was a man who hadn't moved when the door opened. No phone. No weapon in hand. Just presence. He wasn't surprised, which meant he hadn't been warned. Which meant the system had finally done something it hadn't done before. It had arrived without announcing itself. The operators didn't speak his name. They didn't need to. Identity would be confirmed later, through biometrics, through exploitation, through the same system that had failed to find him for months. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Because for the first time, the machine and the man occupied the same space at the same time. No delay. No gap. Just contact. And it hadn't come from speed. It had come from silence. They didn't celebrate. There was no release inside the system. No visible shift in posture. The radios remained controlled. The perimeter stayed locked. External security continued scanning the streets as if nothing had changed. Because nothing had. Not yet. The man was secured within 90 seconds of entry. Flex cuffed. Moved to a seated position. One operator maintained physical control while another began initial site exploitation. No raised voices. No unnecessary movement. The room remained intact, almost undisturbed, as if the operation had been designed not just to capture, but to preserve. That mattered more than the capture itself. Back in Balad, confirmation didn't come immediately. The feed from ISR platforms showed nothing unusual, no movement spikes, no vehicles approaching, no signals activating in response. Task Force Orange monitored the spectrum. Still nothing. No calls. No warnings. No ripple effect. For the first time, the network didn't react. That silence carried weight. Inside the house, biometric kits were deployed within minutes. Fingerprints first, then facial recognition scans, processed through portable systems linked back to JSOC databases. The data moved through secure channels to analysts who had spent months chasing fragments of this man's existence. Now they had something real. But even then, confirmation was cautious. Because the system had been wrong before, the chain of command held. No announcement was made beyond the immediate operational loop. The on-site commander relayed status upward, secure but unverified. JSOC leadership didn't escalate it yet. Not to Washington, not to broader commands. They had learned that lesson. Too many near successes had collapsed under premature certainty. So they waited. Inside the target building, sensitive site exploitation continued with controlled precision. Laptops were imaged on site. Hard drives removed, labeled, and bagged. Handwritten notes were photographed in sequence before being touched. Every object was treated as part of a system, not as evidence of a moment. Because this wasn't just about who they had captured. It was about what remained unseen. The detainee didn't speak. Not under initial questioning. Not under controlled pressure. He understood the environment. Understood the stakes. His silence wasn't resistance. It was discipline. And that confirmed something else. This wasn't a peripheral figure. This was someone who had operated long enough to understand how systems break. Extraction was delayed by design. No immediate helicopter pickup. No visible escalation. The assault element held position longer than standard protocol, 12 minutes beyond clearance, ensuring no external observation could correlate the operation with a specific moment. When they moved the same way they arrived. Quietly, on foot. The detainee was hooded, guided, controlled, but not rushed. Every step measured to avoid drawing attention. External elements collapsed inward, then expanded outward again, dissolving into the urban terrain before any pattern could form. Only then did the aircraft come in. MH-47 Chinooks approached from a different vector than insertion. Higher altitude. Shorter exposure. The pickup zone was offset, 1.6 kilometers from the original landing site, selected to avoid pattern repetition. By the time the helicopters touched down, the operation no longer existed in any observable form. From the outside, nothing had happened. No noise. No reaction. No signal. Back in Balad, the data began to align. Fingerprints matched first. Then facial metrics. Then fragments from previous intercepts. Voice patterns reconstructed from partial recordings, now compared against controlled samples. It wasn't instant, but it was conclusive. The man they had been chasing was no longer moving. And what followed was something the system hadn't experienced before. Stability. Not victory. Stability. Because the network didn't collapse overnight. It didn't fragment in visible ways. There were no immediate spikes in communication, no desperate attempts to re-establish control. It simply slowed. Nodes that had once been active went silent, not abruptly, but gradually. Couriers stopped moving with the same frequency. Meeting patterns dissolved. The background noise that had once filled the system began to thin. For months, they had been chasing signals that led nowhere. Now, the absence of signals meant something. The system adjusted again. Not through orders. Through recognition. They had finally touched the center of gravity, not because they had identified it perfectly, but because the environment around it had changed in ways that couldn't be faked. And inside that change, a quiet realization settled across the command structure. Everything that followed, the intelligence, the operations, the outcomes, would now be shaped by this moment. Not because of who they captured, but because of how they did it. What changed wasn't visible at first. There was no announcement inside JSOC declaring a new doctrine. No formal document that said the system had been wrong or that it needed to evolve. Institutions like that don't admit failure in clean language. They adjust in silence. But the shift was there. Before that night, the machine had been built on a single belief. That if you could compress time enough, if you could move from signal to strike faster than the enemy could react, you would eventually close the gap. They had proven the opposite. Speed had made them predictable. Predictability had made them visible. And visibility had made them irrelevant. After that operation, the architecture of JSOC didn't slow down. It became selective. Targeting cycles were no longer measured by how quickly they could act, but by how well they understood what they were seeing. Task Force Orange didn't stop collecting signals, but signals were no longer treated as truth. They became indicators. Fragments. Something to question, not something to trust. The role of intelligence changed. Before, It had been about accumulation. More data, more intercepts, more patterns layered on top of each other until they resembled certainty. Now it was about subtraction. What didn't fit? What didn't react? What remained when pressure was removed? CIA Special Activities Division networks expanded, not as support elements, but as equal partners in the targeting process. Human sources were no longer used to confirm signals. They were used to challenge them, to contradict the model, to expose where the system's assumptions broke down. That required time, and time had once been considered a liability. Now it became a weapon. Delta Force and other JSOC elements adjusted their operational posture accordingly. Assault squadrons were still capable of launching within minutes, but they didn't always. Commanders held missions longer, sometimes watching targets for days instead of hours. The question was no longer, can we hit this? But should we? That distinction didn't exist before. The chain of command evolved with it. Decision authority remained compressed, but the inputs changed. Analysts, operators, and intelligence officers no longer pushed toward immediate action by default. They pushed toward alignment. When signals, human reporting, and environmental behavior converged, then the system moved. Not before. The result wasn't just more successful raids. It was fewer unnecessary ones. And that mattered more than it seemed. Because every operation that didn't happen was one less signal broadcast into the environment. One less pattern for the enemy to study. One less opportunity to be understood. JSOC stopped teaching the enemy how it worked. That was the real transformation. Over time, this approach scaled. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively enough to change the trajectory of the conflict. Targeting became less about chasing individuals and more about mapping systems, identifying how networks functioned, where decisions were made, and what conditions allowed them to exist. The focus shifted from movement to structure, from activity to intent. And with that shift came a different kind of control. Not absolute, not permanent, but real. They began to find targets who didn't want to be found, not because they moved faster, but because they understood where those targets felt safe. They operated inside those spaces, quietly, without announcing their presence until it was too late to react. The machine hadn't become stronger. It had become aware, and that awareness carried forward. Years later, the same principles would define how JSOC operated in other theaters. Faster where it needed to be, slower where it mattered. Integrated not just in capability, but in understanding. Intelligence and operations no longer feeding each other blindly, but correcting each other in real time. It looked seamless from the outside. It wasn't. Friction was still there. Misjudgments still happened. Targets were still missed. But the system no longer assumed it was right simply because it was fast. That assumption had been removed. And with it, the illusion of control. Because control had never come from technology, or speed, or force. It came from insight. From recognizing that the enemy wasn't a fixed point to be located, but a system to be understood. They had everything in the beginning. Satellites, drones, elite units, data flowing faster than any military in history. And still, they couldn't find one man. In the end, they didn't win because they moved faster. They won because they finally understood why he was never where they expected him to be.